Yeah, just a quick review of the HOZMOZ ventilated weightlifting gloves. So if you're looking for a pair of good weightlifting gloves, there's so many out there. So I'm just going to cover a few points of these, just give you a few things to think about, maybe help you guide your decision. So this does have an open back in it. A lot of them don't. A lot of them might have mesh or some ventilation, which is good. But this actually has an open back, which actually makes the glove so your hands won't sweat as much. So I really do like that aspect of it. I thought that was a good feature. It does have a towel panel here. So in other words, if you're like sweating a lot and you rub your hand, you usually rub your forehead on the back of your hand. Well, they got you covered because they have a little extra area here for sweat. So you can just use that. That also saves you having to carry a towel around too. Or if you're using these like for biking or something, you might have a towel handy. You can just use the glove. Other things, they do have a silicone grip in the palm. Now that's important because that's probably one of the big reasons why I actually use workout gloves, is because if I'm doing like pull-ups or doing the rowing or something, it's easy to lose your grip. And the more friction you have in the glove, the better your grip's going to be, the less force you have to contract with your muscles with a grip, because the friction kind of holds it in place a certain amount. But they got you covered here pretty good with these silicone grips in the palm. So I really like that feature. Plus they made a cool little design out of it. Last thing, well, not last thing, but they have these little, one thing with workout gloves I noticed, like I had a pair of neoprene ones, and I pull them off, and after a while you pinch them here, and the neoprene starts to come off, right? So what they've done is, and plus getting these gloves off period, especially if they're sweaty, is kind of hard. Well, anyway, they got you covered there too, because they have these little pull tabs on the middle two fingers, and that way when you're taking them off, you can pull them from there. You don't have to wreck the rest of the glove. It makes them easy to get off too, which that's another great feature. Last thing to know about these is they are hand wash only. So you can't throw them in the washer. You do have to hand wash them, so just know that, because sometimes that's a deal breaker for some people, especially bachelors who don't like to do the laundry. Anyway, let's say you're doing a lot of lifting also, and you have a shoulder issue that's keeping you from lifting weights. I'd also recommend this book while we're talking about weightlifting, 6-Minute Torn Rotator Cuff Solution for Seniors. Kind of forget for seniors, because honestly a high-level athlete could use this program. If you have any kind of a shoulder problem, you want to make sure you're doing at least one exercise to strengthen your rotator cuff. And I'll tell you why, especially if you want to avoid a shoulder problem. Shoulder is a very shallow ball and socket joint, and it depends heavily on the muscles to support it. Now that's unlike your hip, which is also a ball and socket joint, but just because of the deep bony architecture, it doesn't really ever rely on the muscles to keep it in place. Shoulder is all about muscles holding that sucker together. And guess which muscles do it? The rotator cuff. Matter of fact, if your arm is still, before you even lift your arm up and start moving your arm, your rotator cuff contracts to keep everything in place. Particularly, I ran across a study showing that's interesting. Anyway, real briefly, or if you have a tear, this is a great resource for a tear. Starts out with anatomy, what is the rotator cuff, what it does, what are the muscles. Goes a great question and answer section, what are the symptoms of a rotator cuff tear, any arm maneuvers that might indicate I have a tear, what imaging tests are used, just a lot of things you want to know if you do have a tear, or you think you have a tear. What kind of tears are there different kinds of tears? Now here's a good one. I have a rotator cuff tear and I'm in a lot of pain. I need surgery, right? So this is a common scenario. People will have shoulder pain. Eventually they'll get an MRI, they'll show a tear, they'll think, oh, that's the problem. That's why all my pain is. Well, not necessarily. So you don't want to ever go by your pain alone. And let me tell you why. So this book scientifically answers the question, all its questions, with studies. So each one of these boxes is a study. So to answer this question, they looked at studies where you take, let's say, 100 people with a rotator cuff tear, right? You measure the size of their tear, and then you run a pain scale, like a visual analog scale, and you find out, hey, how bad are these people hurting? Then you got 100 people, the size of their tear, and you know how bad they're hurting. Now you would think there'd be a perfect correlation. Hey, the bigger the tears, the harder, the more pain they're in. That's actually not what any of these studies are really finding. What they're finding is that there's people walking around with big old tears that hardly hurt, and likewise there's people with just little tears that are in a lot of pain. And then you got a whole group of people they're finding that have asymptomatic tears. And there are actually lots of MRI studies on that, showing that, take 100 people with no pain, you MRI their shoulder, and they find people with these tears. So there's a high rate of that as well. That's why you don't ever want to just jump into surgery just because my shoulder hurts. Well, you may not have that big of a tear, or you could have an asymptomatic tear and something else is giving you your shoulder pain. So just some things to think about. What will happen if I leave my rotator cuff tear alone? Like, what's the natural history of a tear? Here's probably the best one. How does exercise compare to surgery when it comes to treating my torn rotator cuff? So the only way to scientifically answer that is the randomized controlled trials. So here again, that's the highest form of proof in medicine that a treatment is actually effective. So let's say you take 100 people with a rotator cuff tear, 50 you randomly assigned to surgery, the other 50 you randomly assigned to a good exercise program. And then you follow them, for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Some of these studies actually go on for years. So this book has compiled all the randomized controlled trials that compare surgery to exercise, And so, say like 3 years out, who did better? The people that did a good exercise program, or the people that had surgery? Well, come to find out, once you look at all of them, you're going to end up in the same place. So just keep that in mind as well. So anyway, to that end, it ends with an exercise program. There's 3 different levels. So like if you can hardly move your arm, if you have a bad shoulder problem, you can start with the first level. But if you have a high functioning shoulder and just want to avoid a shoulder problem or a rotator cuff problem, you can do the advanced one. So just something good to know for weightlifters. Anyway, if you're looking for good workout gloves, I think this is a decent pair, so check them out.